Let's get started slowly. I'm going to turn off the music. So thank you for joining. Just as a housekeeping, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can ping Tomomi that are technical of nature. Ping Tomomi. There's Tomomi. She's waving at you, and you probably already touched base with her earlier through emails and so on. If you have any questions for me, please type them in the chat window and feel free to send them to everyone so that everyone can see the question. And I'll be watching over the chat window. So if something comes up and you just want to kind of double click on that, feel free to type it in. You can also ask the questions at the end as well. And we will be recording this. We will be emailing you the recording as well as the deck afterwards. So expect an email either from me or from my colleague Nick Markham. So one of us will send this over to you. The reason why the deck is valuable is because it's got a lot of stories. So this particular presentation used to be called the State of Tech Enablement because it was a collection of what your peers in the industry are doing. And so as such, it's got a lot of stories that they told themselves. So with that, I'll get started and tell you briefly how this came about. So many years ago, 2018 to be precise, we started a community called TechnoCon, and some of you are members of that community. Some of you may be new to that. If you're new, Tomomi will drop in a link how to join. But essentially, at the time, I was at Twitter, and I was basically running Twitter University, so in charge of technical enablement for engineers over there when the company was much smaller. And I was comparing notes with my colleagues at Salesforce and LinkedIn, so Rajan and Jenny, and we basically noticed that there is no community for us, people that are responsible for dealing with learning and development for technical folks. So we started TechnoCon out of that. And first year it was at LinkedIn. Following year it was at Twitter. So this is the photo taken in 2019. And then we went virtual with the pandemic, and we've been doing it on a monthly basis. So lots of great talks. So today's talk is really a compilation of the best of talks or stories that we've heard from your peers through TechnoCon. So that's the backstory. So with that, let's dive into tech enablement. So what we observed is that folks like us are dealing with a number of programs that are all targeted toward how do we enable our technical people, mostly engineers and designers and product people, to do their best work. And that includes a number of programs, from onboarding to knowledge sharing to collaborative peer learning, mentorship coaching, documentation, and then wrapping it all together and providing some insights and metrics so that we can justify our own existence. So we kind of took a basket of these different programs and put them under one umbrella, which we call tech enablement. So tech enablement is really loosely a collection of things that we do that didn't really have a name up until recently. So at the beginning of this talk, as you were rolling in, I noticed that many of you introduced yourselves with something in the title that contained the word enablement, and I thought that was nice and fresh. It seems like the tech enablement as a term is really catching on, and more you are having job titles in that field, which is awesome. So why tech enablement? Well, usually when a company is small, you don't need this, right? Everyone is at the same table, knowledge flows freely. The number of connections between humans is relatively small, and it's easy to manage. And as you add more people, the number of connections, that fabric of knowledge among your colleagues starts to grow exponentially. And so things start to be really hard to reason about and to kind of get to that level of shared understanding. And so what we often see is that a large company becomes really just a collection of siloed smaller teams. So each team is on their own. And so that's definitely an issue. And that becomes something that slows down the productivity. So essentially, as you scale, you introduce drag. So we call this organizational drag. And as I mentioned, through this presentation, we'll rely on stories and not just lecture what we think is right, but actually point out how actual companies are doing that. So with that, I'll start with Twitter. So this is one place where I cut my teeth and got to learn the ropes as I was sort of doing it. So basically, back in 2013, Twitter was pre-IPO, and it was doubling. It was about 1,000 engineers and doubling. And essentially, what we were noticing is that we were adding people very rapidly, yet we weren't adding productivity. We didn't have a lot to show for, right? And so essentially, what happened was we were introducing the cost of adding people, because people didn't know how to do work. They did not understand how Twitter works or how we work at Twitter. So that was the primary goals of why we formed Twitter University, as a way to solve that. And so this story, and like I said, you'll get this article, this presentation afterwards, but each of these links will open up a full-on article, which is a presentation from Technicon with the speaker and a summary of the presentation, as well as often a recording that you'll see here for each one of these. So in this particular one around Twitter, Alex Rudder, who was the VP of engineering at the time, noticed that it was more cost effective for him to improve the productivity of existing engineers by 10% than hire additional 100 or 200 engineers. So he basically formed Engineering Effectiveness and Twitter University as a way to help improve productivity of his existing team and to that the output. So that's the story of Twitter in the early days. Now, and by the way, Alex is one of our investors, and so that's kind of how, and I used to report to him, so that's why I also kind of have this story firsthand. Another story from another social media company. So this is Wei Cheng, also one of our investors. Wayne happens to be one of the early engineering managers at Facebook. And so at the time, Facebook was much smaller. It was about 300 engineers. And what Wayne noticed is that adding engineers, so the same story, adding engineers was not necessarily making them all that productive. They had the whole philosophy, run fast and break things. And the breaking things thing did not work as Facebook scaled. So once you added more feature users, right? So suddenly if you break things, it makes a difference if you're doing that for 1 million people versus 100 million people versus 1 billion people. So breaking things was no longer cool. We needed, or his observation was, Facebook engineers needed a way to run fast, but also have guardrails so they don't crash. And so he invested in creating Facebook's Bootcamp, which is arguably one of the most celebrated in the industry. It's not just the bootcamp, it's also how they recruit. They don't recruit into a team, they recruit into the org first and have you be there before you actually join a specific team. So there's a shared understanding of how Facebook as a company operates. So that's something that they did that was really remarkable and somewhat unique in the industry. And so Wayne observed that. And so this is, again, his story. Like I said, you'll be able to read and watch all that. The point of this presentation is just to point out that tech enablement is something that even the bigger companies that we know today had in their early days. So to talk about tech enablement, we introduced something called a Tech Enablement Maturity Index, or in other words, where are you in terms of your current practices? So we came up with this 5 levels, and I'll talk about each one of them separately and give you a little bit of a color what they mean. But essentially, level 1 is you're not doing anything. Level 2 is somebody doing something, but it's not their job. Level 3 is somebody is doing something, it is their job, but it's a part-time their job, to a full ownership, and ultimately to a fully funded team. So it really has to do with how much investment you are putting into this. So let's see how this plays out, and we'll tell the stories along the way. So level 1, sink or swim. So essentially, you're not doing anything. As a new hire, I join your company and I get a laptop, and maybe HR tells me about, paperwork and where the bathrooms are at. And this is not just a function of small organizations. We've seen this at very large organizations. So I personally worked with WeWork and to ramp up their engineering university. And this is at a time when they were doubling. They were going from 800 engineers to 1,600 engineers. And they needed a way to do that deliberately. So, and they wanted to leapfrog their TAMI index, right? Because they were, at the time, they did nothing. They would hire great talent. They would literally give them brand new MacBook Pros without even telling them how to install, what to check out the repo and how to install the development environment. None of that was provided. It was all sort of, a hodgepodge of, find the right person, tap them on the shoulder, and good luck. So throwing basically great talent to the deep end of the pool, hoping that they can swim. And so that did not work for them. So they called us in and invested in building their engineering university. GitHub, another great company, large company, very effective at what they do. But they, as a company, see teams as owning onboarding. So in other words, there isn't as much of a GitHub engineering focused knowledge sharing or common understanding. It's more sort of every team on their own. So that's why we put them in a level 1. And we see this often at many companies. So just something to observe as a pattern, where the onboarding is onto a team, so small team, plus minus 10 people, versus onboarding into the engineering organization, where the team can be, and an individual can become nimble and portable across various teams, which is more desirable. So that's level 1. Level 2, hero volunteer. So basically, at some point, somebody, and usually this is an old-timer, had enough of this hodgepodge, do nothing about getting people up to speed, and they start doing this as a side project. So we've seen this at Twitter. I've seen this firsthand. Prior to us creating Twitter University, there was something called Flight School. It was created by one person, Ryan King, and he was an old-timer, started at Twitter very, very early on. So he had a lot of social capital, and he basically raised his hand and said, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to make this better. And so that's exactly what he did. And then later on, they brought us in and made it into even more deliberate program. Carbon Health, we'll talk about them later, but Carbon Health experienced this as well. They had quite a rapid growth, and I'll talk about this in a bit. So partial ownership. So at some point, leadership acknowledges that deliberate tech enablement is a must, and it's a strategic thing, and does something about that by basically funding it. And so that funding usually comes in a form of, it's somebody's second, an additional job, not additional job, sorry, another part of their job. So usually this is a technical program manager or TPM or somebody like that steps in and actually owns it. So for the first time, the initiative of tech enablement is owned by somebody. So we've seen this at Carta, and I mentioned Carbon Health as a story. And again, all these are linked. So Carbon Health was experiencing a very rapid growth in the early days of COVID. So they went through, I forget the data, but I believe it's from 5 to 90 engineers in 7 months or something. So it was quite a rapid growth that they experienced. And it started by having one person own it part-time. And then they brought in a program manager to help out, and then sort of they scaled it up because it was no longer possible to just have somebody do this on the side. Now, usually larger companies are more deliberate about this. They notice the need for this and they fully fund it. So there's a person with a tech enablement or engineering, learning, development in title, actually owning all these initiatives. So many of you are having titles like that from what I can tell from introductions. So ultimately, it becomes somebody's job and ownership, and they get to create a roadmap for that. So some stories that we've hosted at Technocon, one is from Spotify. So Spotify noticed that knowledge sharing is something that's very, very important to them strategically. It boosts their innovation. Kia Motors also wanted to democratize their learning. This is the Kia Motors America. So this is basically not the manufacturing part, but the part that is based in California that innovates, and it's a much smaller organization, very knowledge driven. Cruise also being on the forefront of autonomous vehicles, wanting to train their subject matter experts and share knowledge. If you kind of imagine the complexity of autonomous vehicles and different disciplines involved, right, from AI to robotics to hardware, etc., all that coming together to basically help their engineers and their product people be on the same page, share understanding, and to run faster. And Credit Karma, relatively smaller out of companies on this list, but they early on recognized the value of having a Credit Karma University as a way to deliberately up-level their talent. And at some point, level 5, we have a fully funded team, usually a property of much larger companies, and we'll mention some of these companies as we keep on going. When you say large, on one extreme, we have Microsoft. They literally onboard 1,200 engineers per month, and this number is probably higher now. This is probably about a 6-month-old data point, and they have over 100,000 engineers. So this is a very, very large operation. But then we have Salesforce that looks much smaller compared to Microsoft with their 18,000 engineers. They obviously also have a dedicated team, as well as Netflix that cares about their culture quite a bit. And I mentioned Twitter University a few times. So with that, we're going to jump into the section of how do you do this, right? So what are the building blocks? So if you are in charge of tech enablement and you want to kind of up-level your game on the TEMI index, how do you do that, and what are the best practices, and we'll tell stories of how your peers are doing this or have done it. But first, let's take a look at as an example of something that is pretty common. So in this case, we have onboarding, and this represents onboarding from a new hire to a fully enabled employee. Now, the same thing applies for what we call continuous onboarding. So it's not just that you onboard new hires. You often onboard existing people onto the next level, right? So for example, maybe I'm an engineer and I want to become an engineering manager. Maybe I'm a junior engineer and I would like to figure out my pathway to a staff engineer. So the aspects of onboarding are always present. So it's a never-ending process and not just limited to new hires. So I just kind of want to acknowledge that first. But the steps are more or less similar, right? So how do we do that? Well, so the blue boxes here represent things to think about related to the experience of those being onboarded. And then these are the various activities. And then the black boxes here are things to consider just for yourselves as operators, right? So on one hand, we need to codify knowledge. What does it mean to operate at the next level, right? Dumping knowledge onto somebody through either live learning or self-paced is not sufficient. We also need to give them an opportunity to practice and internalize this knowledge, right? So there are various ways we've seen companies do this. It could be workshops where people get together and practice or do simulations. It could be code labs. That's something a little bit newer that we're seeing from Google. But the point is to give participants an opportunity to participate. Now, even though somebody got all the knowledge and got to practice, it doesn't mean that things don't go bump at night once they actually start practicing this in day-to-day life, right? So support is important. And what we see companies do is provide support in the form of buddy system, mentorship, coaching, office hours, ask me anything sessions, etc. But there is a way to deliberately support people on their journey to becoming enabled at the next level. And then in the back office, often you want to collect the data to understand how things are going. So that could be assessments, could be surveys, quizzes, etc. It helps if the data is integrated so that you can easily slice and dice and get insights into how things are really working. So you can close the loop, involve managers into developing their own people, etc., etc. So this is a set of steps to consider because it's not just about dumping a bunch of slides at people. That's my point here. It's much more evolved. So with that, let's talk about onboarding. So onboarding is typically the most obvious one. It's the low-hanging fruit, and usually tech enablement starts there. So we're going to point to a couple of stories. So I mentioned Carbon Health as an extreme case, just because they got into a hot seat with COVID. So they literally scaled from 5 engineers to 90 engineers in under a year. So you can imagine that at 5, the scale is so small that they wouldn't have anything. There was no process for onboarding. There was no process for knowledge sharing or documentation or any of that. It was very ad hoc, 5 people sitting around the same desk, more or less, right? But as they rapidly added people, they needed to unblock that knowledge so that everyone is on the same page how they do things here. So they leaned on, initially they leaned heavily on documentation because they didn't have much. So they kind of had the benefit of a clean slate. But then they started realizing that they needed to also not just throw a bunch of wiki pages at people, but also create human relationships and collect feedback and understand what's going on. So they kind of did a TAMI. They went through an entire TAMI maturity rather quickly by having somebody be doing nothing, having somebody have this as a second job, hiring a program manager, scaling that up, and having a deliberate onboarding. So it's quite an interesting story, and I'll share the deck so you can reference that story later on. So look out for an email after this. LinkedIn. LinkedIn is one of our bigger customers. We've been working with them from the early days, and we'll be talking about their onboarding in a couple of cases here. But this one has to do with COVID and their nimbleness. So they always had engineering bootcamp, or had it for a long time, and it was based on a traditional. You go to their Sunnyvale office and you basically take the bootcamp with your cohort in a conference room in Sunnyvale. So it's very much live experience, like many companies do. And then the COVID hit, and they rejiggled the entire experience to be remote first, and did this in 3 days. Now, the easy way out would be to just say, hey, let's take a live learning and put it online via Zoom or similar, right? But that's not what they did. They basically said, what are the good parts of our onboarding and what makes sense to move online and what makes sense to keep live, right? And they kind of looked at bits and pieces, and they created this blended experience where some parts are matter of fact, right? Like, go set up your environment. Here's steps that don't fail in setting up your environment. But then there's some aspects of, hey, meet the management team, understand how we work here, understand the stack which they would whiteboard. So those things they reserve for live, and they kind of optimize how they do that with instructors in a similar time zones. So no longer needed to be in Sunnyvale, but they would kind of limit Pacific time zones to people in that time zone, etc. So this is their story, and they were quite happy with how that turned out. And like I said, they did the whole rejiggle in just a handful of days. Uber faced the same problem and did something similar but different. So the similar thing is that they realized that they need to move things make it virtual. So they did that. They also made it a blended experience, and not just moving in person onto Zoom, but actually figuring out what makes sense for what modality. But Uber, unlike LinkedIn, has a very different product given different geographical areas. So for example, Uber product in Brazil is different than in Boston, than San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera. So they wanted to give local teams also some autonomy. So this is about creating a part of onboarding that is consistent for the mothership, yet giving also the autonomy to local teams so they can onboard locally as well. So this is their story, how they did that. Now, there are more onboarding stories, and you'll be able to find them under ideas that were collected from Technicon community. But I wanted to move on to a next tool in the toolbox. And in this case, it's peer and collaborative learning. So once you onboard people, so you get them to competency, right? Now, in addition to being competent, your employees also over time figure out best practices, right? So at Twitter, we used to say the smartest people are right here in the building. So how do we unleash their insights, their best practices, and share them across the entire organization? That was the challenge that we set to solve for. Right. So the smartest people are in the building. And so how do we do that? And we leaned on peer collaborative learning. And by the way, we'll be talking more about this in another webinar that's coming up. So it's September 22nd. I'll be double clicking on peer collaborative learning. So feel free to sign up for that. I'll drop the URL here so you have it in the chat as well. So that's coming September 22nd. With that, I'll tell you a couple of stories today. So I already mentioned Twitter. So what we did there is when we came in, I went around and I started talking to a lot of people to understand what the issues are, where many people are tripping up, what are the common systems and tools and processes that are poorly understood. And then I started tapping on the shoulder people that own those internal tools and systems. And through that, we then created short presentations, workshops, classes, usually live, right? So basically, an engineer with a close understanding of that particular system would once a month host 1 hour, 2 hour whiteboard sessions and explain that. So very lightweight ask on the part of subject matter experts. And so this became really popular very quickly. So we had, within a year, we had 1 in 5 engineers teach classes. We had 10,000 student hours. So it became the highest rated program at Twitter in engineering at the time. So it was very, very popular very quickly. And it was all led by the internal subject matter experts. So that was a surprising finding when we did that. It turned out that Spotify arrived to the same conclusion. So they call it collaborative learning versus peer learning, but essentially the same thing. They understood that different teams had different knowledge networks, so-called knowledge networks, and they wanted to connect that. And they wanted to connect those knowledge networks so that the knowledge is not bottlenecked. So once that knowledge freely flows from team to team and thus breaking silos, what happens is innovation flourishes, right? So they become more innovative and creative as a company, and they also become more aligned. And so that was their insight of why they do that. And so they dedicated a person that owns this program, and it's successfully up and running at Spotify. Netflix, Netflix, we've been working with Netflix for many years now, started with engineering, but this particular story is about their studio team. So Netflix Studio, prior to pandemic, was doing a lot of live learning classes. We know because we were powering that. And then pandemic hit, and they said, we're Netflix, we're more about videos, and people are now not coming to the office, and so they're everywhere. And we're going to swing the pendulum from live to content. So we're going to record these great videos, and we're just going to put them up on our intranet, and our employees and contractors will find them there. And so we go, right? It's going to be more effective, right? That was at least the hunch. What proved to happen is that so in their words, then they did this talk at Technicon, is they lost human touch with the actual new hires at the most sensitive time when they're entering the company and wanting to be indoctrinated in the culture. And if you know anything about Netflix, culture is very important to them. So losing touch with culture is not a good thing. So they realized that rather quickly because they had a way to collect data and get insights, right? So that's something that they're very much data driven. And so they noticed that. And so what they did is they leaned the pendulum back by adding office hours. They call them AMA sessions, ask me anything. And so they basically added a human component in a very scalable way back into the program. So there was still sort of like, hey, you can learn at your own pace, but there's also a human component and workshops and classes. And so through that, basically pushing the pendulum back toward live, they created a very rich, immersive, blended experience for their studio people. So more on that, and there's also a recording behind this link. I mentioned LinkedIn before. I mentioned in the context of onboarding or their end onboarding. There's also a story here about them noticing that they have way too many tools. And so basically, they as a company had 5,000 engineers at the time, hundreds of tools, and often same tool, competing tools for the same job, right? And it became confusing. And so they wanted to kind of help with that through better discovery, better content quality, and better understanding of what the options are. So if I'm an engineer and I have 3-5 databases at my disposal to use, how do I know which one to pick? So they leaned on knowledge sharing as a way to educate internal engineers of the different use cases for different tools, so that people are clued in, so that they know which tool to use for which job. To do that, they needed simpler discovery. So prior to us coming in there, they basically had some knowledge live in their wiki, some knowledge live in their various documentation along the code, some knowledge live in Slack, etc. So it was all a hodgepodge, and you basically did not know where to ask the question of how do I learn which database is best for what job, right? And so, so we basically help them with that discovery and knowledge, best practice, sharing of best practices, so that there was a better understanding, so that people can choose the better tools and be more effective at what they do. So this is that story of closing the knowledge gaps. Now, technical documentation is often comes very early in as another tool in the tech enablement toolbox. So usually when I speak to smaller companies, they just say, oh, for tech enablement, all we do is we have great docs, right? So we basically, smaller companies usually start documenting everything in their wikis, in their Notion, Google Docs, whatever they use. And as you come in as a new hire, they just point you to the right folder and off you go. There are a couple of challenges with this. While it's promising scalability, often what happens in reality is docs diverge from what they're documenting. They become stale, they become unknown, they become hard to discover, right? And I've seen this firsthand at Twitter. I inherited the tech docs team. We at the time had the world's largest Confluence installation. It was 200 spaces and 250,000 pages. The problem wasn't the things weren't documented. The problem was that if I search for something, I would get 10 different answers from 10 authoritative engineers, and I didn't know which one to go with. So it was basically increasing confusion rather than decreasing it over time. So it's probably good in the beginning, but it doesn't scale for some reason. And so we hosted a panel at TechnoCon with LinkedIn, Uber, Spotify, and Splunk, companies that are sort of known for good documentation management. And so they told their stories and how they manage their culture of documentation, how they manage discoverability, drift, ownership, and different types of docs. And essentially, the gist of this is that there's no silver bullet, but there are some best practices, and it starts by identifying different types of docs. So certain docs that are related for code make sense to live with code. Certain docs make sense to live in different places. But fewer systems, better discovery definitely helps. And so this is their story. I just want to mention also mentorship, coaching, and office hours as another tool that we see people apply a lot in for engineering, for technical enablement. When we say mentorship coaching, we're realizing that this means different things to different people. So we kind of broke it down into buddy system, career mentors, professional coaching, and office hours. And so I'll give you a couple of examples from a few companies to go with this. So many years ago, we were powering peer learning at Airbnb. It was one of our early customers, and they loved it. And they came along and said, you know what, we would also like to extend workshops and classes, not just do peer workshops and classes, but also do mentorship. So we created peer mentorship as well as a program. They actually told the story at 2018 to TechnoCon on stage, how they basically brought, within the first year, got so 500 employees out of 5,000. So 1 in 10 would teach, would be a mentor at Airbnb. And so that was internal peer mentorship. So everyone could be a mentor and everyone could have a mentor. So it was truly democratized at scale, and it was something that worked really well in their cultural context. Shopify, also one of the early people we worked with, did a different approach. So the point here is that there are different ways to the same top of the mountain. So Toby, the CEO of Shopify, had a personal coach, and he was very happy with the results of that. So he brought that coach to be a coach for the entire executive team, and they had great results. And so then the executive team thought, well, how do we scale this from, you know, a dozen of us to, at the time, 4,000 employees? And so they basically went and hired a dozen professional coaches. So they now had a team of professional coaches, and they created something called the Coaches Corner. So it became a program funded with a full-time coaches on staff at Shopify. So very different approach than a sort of peer-based model at Airbnb. But the result was similar, right? They, as an employee, there's a place for me to go and get unstuck if I'm stuck. So back to that support aspect through coaching and mentorship at Shopify. Dropbox heard all this at TechnoCon and then did their presentation on their roadmap. So they basically outlined how they're getting to that stage. So they're starting at the time they were starting with a pilot for just executive team, and then kind of broadening up that to all of the employees. So this was their roadmap, and we're going to follow up and see how well that panned out. But it was inspired by a lot of what they heard at TechnoCon as well, in terms of comparing notes with Shopify and Airbnb model. And I'll just mention Autodesk did something different. So Autodesk launched engineering management training. Just like most companies, we grow our engineering managers from existing engineers. So we teach them how to become people managers. And you know, there's the aspect of codifying knowledge and practicing. But then there's the aspect of what happens when a new manager, newly minted manager, actually starts managing. And what they discovered is that there's a need for support network. And what they created is they created a forum-like model. So basically a closed group of 7 to 9 new engineering managers, and usually an experienced one in the mix. And they would get together monthly in a confidential private space where there was a sense of psychological safety with the moderator, and they would get to learn, compare notes from the field with one another, and through that grow collectively together as well. So this was the forum model, slightly different approach, sort of like a group mentorship approach to engineering management development. As we kind of close this, I just want to mention that not all knowledge is internal. You could also have external based knowledge. So 2 examples from 2 different sides of the scale. So Salesforce, it happens to be our first customer. They always, being a more stable company with stable technology, always relied more on external vendors, but they wanted these external vendors to appear like internal subject matter experts and combine them with internal experts. So they basically have a very rich set of external trainers come in and provide training to their employees. And so this has been working really well. It's one person managing hundreds of classes for tens of thousands of engineers worldwide is the type of a scale that they experience. Much smaller company. At the time we started working with them, there were 40 engineers. Now there are 250. Very successful startup story out of Canada, Montreal. They wanted to build their technical university so that they can attract local talent in Montreal, and they relied on their employees going to conferences and bringing back the knowledge into house, and through that creating that brand, recruiting brand also for the team, that this is a great place to work. And they told a follow-up story that I think we just published under Ideas. They spoke at TechnoCon, following up many years of this program, and it's been very, very successful in helping them convert from an e-tailer to a tech-enabled company, and through that, their valuation and everything else went through the roof. So ultimately, there's measuring success is important. So you can run all these programs, but you also want to know how things are working. So two stories I sort of mentioned earlier. One is Microsoft and the other one is LinkedIn. So Microsoft, being on super large, has many tech enablement teams and has a lot of data. And so they often tell how they're doing things to inspire us. But one of the things that they presented in 2020 was that based on their poll, they discovered that a couple of things that were important to them was giving people sufficient time for learning, so that learning doesn't feel like an extra curricular activity. So plugging it into their workflow, giving them enough resources, so internal and external, so they have where to learn, so easy discovery of all learning in one place, but also enabling their managers to get involved in their learning. So this is what Microsoft discovered as closing the loop for measuring what helps move the productivity and culture at the company. And LinkedIn, I mentioned Rajan, he was one of the creators of Technocon along with me and Jenny. He was at LinkedIn at the time. He developed their engineering bootcamp, and he used Kirkpatrick model to track how things are going. A couple of things he discovered is that level 1, smiley sheets was easy. Level 2, demonstrating if people learn stuff, was a little not too hard either. They had their in days, so demo days. So that was their way of demonstrating that. Level 3 and 4 were challenging, and they relied on a survey. So sending a survey out to ex-participants as well as their managers with some delay, usually 30 and 90 days, to basically ask, hey, you learned that. How is that going in your day-to-day? Are you applying it? Is that making a difference on your team? So that's how they measure that. There's a lot more there. And Rajan recently did a newer talk, which we'll be publishing soon as well. So just to close the loop, what we're seeing in the industry, and I kind of alluded this at the beginning, is that in the past, and technical learning was often a property of HR. So it was either ad hoc in engineering, or HR sort of did a little bit of this and that. And it also became a nice to have. So like, it's kind of like almost a luxury to have a learning program. And then what we are seeing is that it's becoming more and more strategic. So one of the great stories was from Peloton. We had them on stage a few months ago. And as they were scaling down, the team at the time basically changed their charter from just, hey, here's learning for the sake of learning, to, hey, here's a team that's going to enable existing engineers and product people to be much more effective at their job, even if the number is smaller, right? And as such, they got recognized by the VP of engineering as not a nice to have, but a strategic investment. So as the company was shrinking that headcount, they actually invested in their now tech enablement team. So that was a success story of changing the charter, changing why they exist, to be not optional, nice to have learning, but be a mandatory, you gotta enable your people to do their best work if you want to be a tech enabled company. So this is a great story from Peloton as well. So with that, I know we're slightly over, but I'm down to hang out. Any questions, comments, concerns? So feel free to type in, or we're a relatively small group, open up mic and also ask a question. And as a reminder, we'll also be emailing you the deck to see if you have any follow-up questions or comments, and also with the links to all the stories I talked about. So questions, comments, anything from anyone?
Could you elaborate a bit more on, I think it was the Airbnb or Spotify, where they had the different teams that had different knowledge, and then they basically made like a more systematized way of sharing that knowledge across the org?
Yeah, so that's we call it Twitter. We call this peer learning in the industry. Sometimes it's called peer learning, sometimes collaborative learning. And I mentioned a couple of stories. One was Twitter University, and the other one is Spotify, Essence University to some extent as well. So that's certainly something that we are seeing as a way to de-silo an organization. Again, I'll be speaking on this at length on September 22nd. Happy to also have a conversation separately on how to do that, how to share the tribal knowledge. But we did a lot of this. I'll just tell you, when I joined Twitter, I talked to Dick Costello at the time, and I asked Dick, he was the CEO. I asked him, what would be his view of success, and he basically said, this is when mobile happened, and it was about converting engineers to become mobile first, right? And he's like, look, mobile is the problem du jour, but there are going to be other issues coming up. And what he wanted was a nimble engineering team. He wanted an organization that's very nimble. So in other words, we can shift gear depending on if it's big data or machine learning or AI, whatever the next hot thing is, right? And prior to that, Twitter was hiring into the team. So each team was a silo for it on its own. And that was the anti-nimble. It was basically meant if I joined one team, I had no idea how another team works. And so that's what we wanted to break as a pattern. So that's kind of why we leaned on this approach. Cool, thanks, Derek. Any other questions, comments? Like I said, I'll be following up as well to see if anything, if you have any questions, and also we'll share the deck. But yeah, anybody else? Anything else?
Hi, Marco. Adam here. Thanks so much for this, by the way. This was really, really great. That's my comment. Here's my question. I selfishly want to ask about game-based learning, but maybe I'll save that for another time. You shared so many examples here from various organizations. I'm wondering if maybe one of the best examples that you can think of an organization that changed, adapted to something internally, and then that just really worked for them internally, and they passed that along to their users and sort of adopted that method, and now they're sort of sharing that, passing that along to their users is the best way that I can put it, where it goes from an internal process, an internal change, to how their learning is structured, to how they then actually interact with their users. I wonder if any example comes to mind when it comes to taking something internally and then shifting it out to your actual end users.
That's a good question. Nothing really comes to mind right away. Yeah, let me think about that, and I'll get back to you on that. A lot of our companies we work with tend to be very large, and so there's a little bit of a moving externally is a little bit more sensitive for them because they have existing customer base. But it's a really good question. I'm sure there's some examples. I just have to think about that.
Sure.
I'll follow up with you, Adam.
Yeah, well, thanks again for this, and I'll definitely be in the collaborative learning webinar on this 22nd there. I'll sign up right after this.
Awesome, thank you. There's a link to what we shared, I think. Cool. Any other comments, questions, concerns, feedback? AMA. Well, thank you all. Like I said, I'll follow up with this ideally today, and yeah, hope to see more of you and hear more from you, and get involved with Technicon. We have great talks coming up. We have, I believe, Microsoft will circle back and tell us how things are going there next, and there are a couple of articles that we also owe you to publish from previous talks, so that's also coming up. Tomomi is working hard on that. So yeah, Tomomi just dropped in the link to Technicon, so feel free to join the community. It's basically community for us by us, so it's totally peer-led, and yeah, we have a slightly new website there. So Chris Schaefer will be talking October 6th about learn insights from Microsoft, and these are some other upcoming talks and so on. And with that, thank you all. Great to see everyone, and stay in touch.